I'm using water stones. There are many paths, right? And if a path works for you, mazel tov, that path works for you. So I'm going to talk about what I believe the three chunks, three stages of sharpening are, and why you might want to engage, some of the options in each of those realms. And if you have a question at any point, just jump in and I will try to answer it as we go along while keeping it in the flow of my little presentation. So, generally speaking, people, I think have an intuition as to what sharp is. The theoretical definition is two planes meeting without any rounding at that point of contact. That means when this plane and that plane come together, there is no curve there. It is just two sharp edges coming together. In the real world, it doesn't quite work that way. But what dull is when these two planes do have a curve here. As soon as this is curved, you're not, the surface you're pushing against the wood is much wider. The thinner that surface, the better it works. So having said that, I'm going to do a brief demonstration. I have a hacksaw blade, which has been just chopped in half, and when you assert that that is not sharp, it's just a broken hacksaw blade. At the tip end, there. It has a little bit to it, but slight hook. All right, so to be honest, I use the same blade for a demo in New Jersey, and then I grind it flat again. So that's where we are now. So, but it is flat. Okay, so the three stages that I think of that you usually go through for carving or sharpening are: one is grinding. That is where you want to remove a lot of metal, mainly because the architecture of the shape isn't correct. So you want to just get through that quickly. You don't need a grinder. You don't need a belt sander. You can do it with this. When I was a kid, let me go back. Who am I? I am part of the New Jersey Boat Club, Ship Modeling Club, and in my youth, I restored 18th century and 19th century furniture in Manhattan. I was an adjunct at NYU and Parsons School of Design for antique stuff and detecting fakes and that kind of stuff. I now am an IT manager, so I don't do anything really technical anymore. But anyway, but I've been much better benefits. So I learned in the English tradition how to do fine cabinetry. And in that model, you didn't need to use a grinder. You just use the stone a long time. So what would take me 6 hours here with a stone, I can do it about 10 minutes here. So I'm much happier with this. So the three chunks, to get back where I was a minute ago, shaping the middle, which I think of as grinding, which I'll demonstrate in a second. Then what I think of sharpening, where I use stones to abrade whatever the piece of metal is to make it sharp. And then honing, where we don't really have stones that quite do it, and so you can use essentially some sort of abrasive impregnated in some sort of medium, and you can use it on slips, you can use it just on a piece of wood where you carve in a chunk, and we'll talk about all that in a second. But first, let's grind a little piece of metal. Now I have these two, what seem to be rather fancy tool rests. I got them for the demonstration in New Jersey because I thought maybe the one I'm using isn't so great. I've been using the tool rest that came with this up until 2 months ago. It works just fine. The issue is more on you becoming comfortable and having a light touch than it is about having the fancy jigs and stuff. If you are excited about jigs, we can talk after I do the presentation. This is the Veritas one that Lee Valley sells, and you can bolt your tool in here if you wish. Clamp it down, and then present. That's fine. And then you can tighten it up, and you can just move it back and forth. Okay. You don't really need to do that if you're doing wide pieces of metal, like something for a full-scale plane, or for the grinders on your planer, machine tools. Then this rocks. But for the tools that we're talking about, particularly for dockside, you don't need this. So, also, if you buy a cheap set of tools from Harbor Freight or any of the box stores, commit to destroying one chisel, and after about a fifth of that chisel, you'll know enough to be comfortable. So my big takeaway for a grinder is it's a light touch. It is this light for me. See the plastic flex just a little bit? That's all I need to touch the stone to make sparks. So, without further ado, I have a dresser for the stone. It has a bit of diamond in it. And that's just to make sure that the stone is flat. Some people like a slight bevel. But once this becomes all black, that means it's full of metal, and it's making more heat than it is cutting. And so heat is the enemy because you can burn metal quite easily on a grinder if you wish. If you have $1,000, you can buy a grinder that has water flowing through it. Very nice, but it's $1,000. So, or maybe $800, whatever, something like that. So,
can you clean those blacks?
Excuse me?
Can you clean that once they get black?
Oh yeah. So literally,
you use your diamond there.
I just literally do that, and then there's dust. I'm not going to do it here because the dust really isn't great for breathing in.
Do you put any moisture? Do you crack water or anything?
For this? No. These are designed to be dry stones, and I operate them dry. Okay. I have met people that use water with them. I don't know if it's recommended or not. I just don't.
Well, clean a little bit more and take the heat away.
Yeah. So what I do in terms of that, which is kind of the next thing I was going to discuss, is that the heat will accumulate in the blade when you're grinding it. And I just have a little thing of a very fancy water dispenser that I've come up with here. And I'll just dip it in there. So after I sharpen this, and I go through all the 3 stages, I'll come back and I'm going to grind this, and I'll show you what it looks like when it burns, just so you can see what that's like. So, without further ado, I have my glasses on. For those of you who have better sight, you should have safety glasses. And while it's slow to come up to speed, it's even slower to turn off. So, that light touch. Now I set this a couple minutes before because I don't want to screw up it afterwards. But you can do it without if you wish. You see the sparks coming off. And again, I didn't really do much aiming, but you can already see that there's some change in that blade when you examined it before, right? Right, so. Now holding my finger here, I can feel when the heat starts to come down this chunk. Either I'll see it burn or I'll feel it. Usually I feel it first, and I'll just drop it in there to dissipate the heat. You can go back and forth if you want. I'm using this trench to kind of stabilize my finger so I can keep this at the same distance. So the work is over. Alright, so then how far do I go? Alright, so now I'm looking, and I can see there's still, at first glance it looks like I've done a pretty good job. Right? But I can see a little reflective line in the bottom where I don't quite have everything there. And that's fine because we're going to go to here, but trying to see that is important, or trying to feel that is important. So, okay, I'm going to see. Hey, what's going on? All right, so far so good. I'll let you know in 20 minutes. And you may remember. Okay, angles. No, that's brief tangent. As I mentioned, I started as someone doing restoration work in New York City, and the people that taught me how to sharpen were people who did carving restoration at that point in time. Nobody ever talked about angles whatsoever. And most of it is like, well, if I'm carving this height, I'm sharpening at this height, it's going to be about the same. And some angles work better, and then you need to relieve some stuff because it doesn't scoop out correctly. On tools like this, the geometry of coming out is a little bit different, so you might have a little bit of width removed here. That's outside the scope of this particular conversation, but we can talk afterwards. But for regular flat chisels, there wasn't a big set of discussions. This is back in the 90s. Nowadays, if you pick up any book, and I have a small library here to recommend the books that I think are great. If you only buy one, this is very frank and practical. If you're curious about the metal work and mechanics of different types of steel, these two are great. They're both made by tool makers. And then this guy I like just because he's kind of a cranky old Englishman, and he has a great book on making tools as well, so he has some good insights there too. So you're welcome to take a look or ask questions at those. But back to your question about angles. Essentially, the steeper the angle, it changes the kind of cut you can get. For planes, people like that steepness because you can smooth out things that generally are a pain in the ass planes. but the lower angles cut more efficiently and take less effort. So there's a trade-off between those. And then if you exceed a certain angle, then the geometry of cutting becomes more of a scraping kind of thing, and that becomes a different thing. So the marketplace has come up with many different things to figure out. I'll pass this around. You'll see those numbers on it. Those are degrees, angle degrees. So you can stick your tool in. Stick your tool in and go, oh, is that 20%? Is that rather 20, or is that 30 degrees or whatever? You can choose what you like, or you can use this to go, oh, I'm close. These two are from Veritas. I'm not sure who made the little dial one. I don't get really too hung up on the angles myself. If the tool is not working for me, then I start messing around with it. But
like 47.37 degrees usually.
Yeah. The one area where I think it becomes important for a lot of people is that if you, and we'll talk about this in a second, if you're using a jig or something where you're going to clamp in, and again, let me go back. All these things I'm talking about at the large scale apply at the small scale. That is for these really small dockyard tools. It's just I'm using the larger ones, A, because I have more of them, and B, it's easier to see. But you can clamp this in and go, oh, I want, this length, and just clamp it there and get that same angle to mate with the stone every time. That is the real benefit of dialing in on a degree angle that you like, is that I can repeat that, and then it's less time. So less time is cool. You don't need the fancy jig. You can literally have a piece of wood with a piece of wood drilled in there, like, oh, that's as far as I need to go. Tighten it up. So you can be very humble about that and still get the same kind of results. So, and honestly, I bought this one in the 90s because I thought it'd make life way better. It didn't. And then I bought this one a couple months ago in prepping for the New Jersey demo because maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there is some amazing stuff and I should check it out. For me, the challenge for most people carving is that there is a manual skill component, which we'll talk about. So where did I put my little thing? All right, so you saw me grind this. And if you, I'll just pass it around real quick. If you look, there was no real trick there, but it looks like it has an angle instead of being flat. And if you feel the bottom, you'll feel there's a little ruffle of metal kind of bent over. It's called a burr. So I'll pass around this one to the other side. So you can feel there's a burr on the flat side of that. Again, just bigger because you can literally see the burr if your eyesight will. If your eyesight permits that these days. So I have the rough geometry of what I want on that particular piece of metal, and now I'm going to sharpen it by taking to what I think of my coarse stone. One thing I should also mention is that in the land of abrasives, there's no constant set of numbers. So if you're older, you might go, oh, that's 80 grit sandpaper. But if you're getting that same sandpaper in Japan, it has more zeros than you remember. If you're getting it in Europe, it's slightly different. So depending on the medium and the abrasiveness, you will see a different set of numbers if they're not corresponding at all. I would literally just use your fingertips. Like this feels kind of rough. It's a little moist. And I ask you don't drop it. It's carpeted, it might last, you might survive that. Whereas this one, in comparison, is smooth.
Hey Eric, all the stones going around, what's the magic of this way of keeping the stones flat, nice stones?
All right, so for me, there's a lot of different, people have different juju or whatever there. So I still use what I was taught 10 years ago back in the 90s, but the old timers. And I just have a second stone. So if I do drop this one, I use that stone. And
all your stones are water stones?
All the well, not really. I have oil stones at home because that's what I started on. I like the water stones because they're cheaper, they work faster, and they're less messy. So, answer, and part of the reason, several questions I've stacked up I have answered. So I have oil stones. These are oil stones, and I'll be honest, I use them with soapy water, and they have not complained so much. So that is not legit. You're supposed to use oil with these, but I use soap and water. They seem to work. These I got already covered in oil, so I use them with oil. And these are really for machinists, but as opposed to thing. All right, to answer your question, how do I keep them flat?
And the reason I ask that is because the old idea was that you're supposed to do this with your tool by constantly moving.
You can. So
That seems really hard to do in practice.
it depends on the tool. If you're doing flat chisels, so I didn't flatten the stone for about a couple years. Then I'm like, oh, I have to get my act together for doing a presentation for the Jersey Club, and it was just a slight ring on these sides. So if you're doing, just flat blades, then you can keep it pretty flat. If you're doing gouges, if you're doing stuff, I volunteer at an organization that's building boats and trying to teach people how to build one-to-one scale boats. And I've seen somebody trying to sharpen something, and they literally put a trench in a coarse stone in about half an hour. And it took about another half an hour to flatten that stone. So it really depends on how you're working. So for me, hold that thought, we'll come back in a second. If you're not really sure what you need to do to get this right, there's a couple things for the stone. And I'll describe what we're going to do for that stone. And that methodology will give you some ruts eventually. But eventually there's a different path, and that will have less. So we'll get that in a second. So, the next thing is I'm going to just use this on there, my coarse stone, to remove that burr and make it a little sharper. Right now, if I try to cut wood with it, it doesn't really cut. Kind of abrades, it doesn't really, same with the unsharp side, I can make the same kind of mark, not sharp. Flat side is easy, because you just put the flat side down. So you can go back and forth, which is the safest way to keep control. But you can also spin. For me, there's two different methods. Some people like to lock their shoulders by their body, so the spinning or the movement is the same, and they kind of sway. Normally, I'd have this rotated like this, but this table has some issues, so I have it sideways. So I come from the method of kind of keeping this area rigid, but all I want to do is just not lift up or rotate any of that. I just want this to be flat against the stone. I want to use the flatness of that stone. And if I'm doing this kind of round motion, that kind of keeps it flat because I'm using the back of this to keep the other surface. But if you're not really sure, then this is the methodology. You can cheat using your finger here to hold that as well. Anyway, so I'm not going to pass around, but if you just press your finger this way, you feel that the burr is gone. Anybody else? So I've either paid 6 people or the burr's gone, one of the two. The trick here is, how do I find that angle this way? So, another digression. So, I need a volunteer from the audience. I really do. Somebody. All right. Dan will lead. All right. So, this is literally store-bought. It is not sharp. It is. You can see there's parallel lines from wherever the belt grinder at Brooks Brothers or wherever the company that they contract to. I want you to try to find where flat is. And if you feel around, you can feel there's a plane where it kind of clicks in and it's making full contact on that front surface. So you can feel that. Okay, so that's all you need to do with any of these tools is feel that same surface and here. Now on a small one, that's more of a pain in the ass, it's really hard to feel. If I've been sloppy about this and instead of being completely flat, I kind of lean down a little bit, I will rub off this corner. Now try to find that same surface on that one. And my assumption is that you'll find it much more difficult to try to find any. And anyone's welcome to try these two things to feel them. So that is the challenge. So for most folks who don't spend a lot of time carving, enter the jig. There's a whole world of jigs. You can spend as much money as you wish on jigs. I don't think you need to spend a lot. This one costs about 20 bucks, 11 if you find a good deal, and it does all the things all the other jigs do, essentially. And why would you want the jig? Just because then I can lock in an angle in theory. I'm not going to go through the exercise, but I can just lock it in, make sure I got that, and I can replicate that. You can literally put a line on your table here, and every time you go to set this up, just move the piece of metal to that line, and you'll have the same setup every time. That is very empowering if you feel like you don't really have a grasp on a sharpening. Because once I have that every time, I can come to the stone, and I can get the same angle making contact every time, which usually means it's quicker to sharpen. So that's probably an easy takeaway. So meanwhile, back to this. So for me, I'm just going to feel it. And the easy way is to just pull it back. You can even have your thumb on the stone to make sure you're making contact. You're not going to abrade your finger away or reveal your bone or bleed or anything. And sometimes I'll have my knuckle make contact too, just to make sure I'm maintaining that same set of angles. And you can rotate if you wish. You can do crazy eights if you like. Not so important for these flat tools, but for gouges, there's a whole set of maneuvers people like to rotate the entire face of the tool against that stone because it's a curved surface. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So this is a coarse stone. Like I said, it kind of feels like, I don't know, kitchen stuff. Yeah, kind of like 320 sandpaper that I grew up with. This is more of the 500, and on the back it's even smoother, although this one's now currently covered in grime from my taking them out of water and then putting them back in water for the trip. I should also say on my, at home I do this on my bench or on a marble countertop that I salvaged from when our house burned. Anyway, and it doesn't shake, and I don't need this kind of black stuff. But the first time I did this demo, everyone's like, shh. So they may help you if your environment's a little more slippery.
How hard are you pushing? Are you really going into it, or are you just lightly?
All right, so that's great. It's a great question. So I'm pushing hard enough. To indent that on pine. So it's pretty hard. And the more confident you are, the harder you can push. The harder you push, the faster it goes. But there might be more stone cleanup. So there's a trade-off there. When I was young, I went through, old timers to give you kind of we learn this way, and it's not quite hazing, but they kind of give you the long path around sometimes. So, I was just mentioning to somebody else here, if you look closely at this one, I'll pass it around, you can see there's little parallel lines here. This was just an old file that had down its ears, and I ground it down on a stone. That took a couple of days of just sitting there with the stone. Cannot recommend. It is not the expedient way. If we have better tools. Anyway, so the tip is kind of sharp. If you look closely, you'll also notice that the corner is chipped out in that blade from the last demo, and I have not fixed it yet. So something to think about. Again, it's not most pristine work. I did that when I was 19, 20, something like that. Anyway, but it still works. I still like that still. So harder is generally better if you can maintain control. You have a question? No, just shock and awe. All right, so you see there's this black stripe coming up. That is the metal coming off of this and being deposited on my stone. And every time you use a stone, you're braiding this, you're dulling the stone a little bit, and you're removing a bit of the stone. So the water stones are nice because they give up, they create a slurry. All this brown gook you see here is the stone's binder releasing itself to present more sharp bits of stone in there. Which is what you want. You want there to be abrasive all the way around.
Now, how often do you have to get your water stone wet?
It depends on the stone. So my stones are old. I bought this in the 90s. I still have it. I have not worn through. Some people go through them in a couple of years. These stones are supposed to stay wet. I take them out. If it doesn't have enough water, I do that. Very, very exciting.
You store them in the water? Do you store them in water?
Yeah, I store them just like this.
Okay.
Literally. So when all the stones are in, they're all covered. But you can buy stones now that don't need to be maintained that way. You can just spritz them with water and they're good to go. So the modern stone doesn't require that.
Yeah.
So
You're saying that for these stones in particular, keeping them in the water, the binder sort of releases the spent.
But so if I reuse them dry, then they abrade a little bit differently, and the recommendation is keep them wet. So they're a little more crumbly if you use them dry. In my experience, I try not to use them, so I'm not really expert in that, but that's my personal experience. Whereas a new one, you're supposed to just spritz it, and that's fine. So the kind of spray thing my daughter uses to mist her orchids, people just do that on these stones, and then they go off the races. When these are wet, then the slurry that comes off and the result is a little smoother. So the truth of the matter is you can use all these stones. You don't have to use them.
Knife blade.
So to be honest, for me, I didn't bring it this time. I brought the Jersey one. I have one of those little belt sanders about this big. And so if I don't want to use one of these stones, I will just run with the belt sander.
Take to get it, one little stop.
It depends on how
Worth it?
So, I believe this still has its price tag. So this was mine for the fabulous price of 88 cents. For 88 cents, I can try
No, but
it.
is it worth the time sharpening it and just buy new ones?
Oh, you definitely.
It's worth sharpening.
It's worth sharpening something, yeah. So, I mean, depending on how boutique your tool is,
I could see that. I could see it's worth sharpening that tool.
right, so that's like $40 if you're going to buy a new one. I generally don't buy new ones if I can avoid it.
Oh yeah, I agree with you there.
So-
That is a throwaway tool, yeah.
Yeah, but just because it's dull, it still has literally another 100 years of life in it. And if you can figure out how to sharpen it, then you have access to all that. And when they're really sharp, they can do truly stupidly amazing things. Sharp solves a lot of problems. I'm not going to say this in a way that I can put money behind it, but you can cut across the grain and do all the wrong kind of cuts if it's really sharp. You know, so that is a great deal of liberation if you're doing some sort of weird little niggly thing where you're trying to get something where the cut can't be done from a different angle. Any sort of figured wood, anything like that. Yeah, figured wood. If you're, if you're trying to cut out, part of a hand or something weird, or some shapes where the geometry isn't working with you. If it's really sharp, you can fake it and it'll still work. If it's not sharp, you're just going to rip. So, I'll come back to this in just a second. All right. I'm going to pass this around. Essentially, it has just a couple cuts. The thing to look for is that with the grain, it's easier to cut, and with against the grain, it's harder to cut. Some of the cuts are done with dull tools, and some are done with sharp tools. The dull tools don't cut, so then they rip. And you're going to see what that wood looks like ripped. And again, it's just, why do I want sharp? Because sharp doesn't rip the wood. And that's really what we want. I want the tool to cut the wood with control and not make a mess.
So when you know you need to sharpen it is when it starts to shed.
Yes. If you're doing a larger project and you're spending a lot of time carving or cutting or whatever, you will feel it before you see it. In my personal experience, and maybe that's different for you or similar, but you'll feel the difference because it's just slow labor to kind of
Grab and maybe you need to sharpen it.
Yeah, so some people literally have, not the stones necessarily, some people have stones right next to them, like turners always. They're turning wood, they can literally just turn over, sharpen, and come back. But a lot of people have honing, the third stage, which I've got to yet, right there on the bench, so they can just kind of do a little bit of work there and come back, and it feels right again. All right, so we sent that around. I think I saw the question. Did I not answer anybody's questions so far?
Just on that point of how often you have to retouch on a stone, do you just use a strop stick, like a strop stick with rouge on it, it'll keep you going for a while?
Yeah. Just literally, I mean, I made these when I was a kid, but this is jumping ahead slightly. Do I have that here? I will have a piece of scrap. I will take the tool that I'm using. I will cut a channel with a gouge and use the corner, and that is how I will stroke. in the moment.
Yeah.
And because the cut, I'll come back to this in a minute. To speak in English, but that allows me to get a matching cut immediately. I just take a stick and then I go back and I stroke using just the soft stroke.
Yeah.
So that's almost instantaneous. But I'll explain that in a second. All right, so where was I? I was here.
I was interrupted.
I should also note that if you go lightly, then that also doesn't. There's nothing wrong with going light. It just takes more time, and you generally have more control. So if you're not sure, the easiest thing is find that angle, maybe put it in a jig, and just take long, slow, parallel pulls to get where you're going.
So you never push.
Some people do. I don't. That little burr that we're talking about, I feel two things can happen. One is if you push, you can literally cut into the stone and it takes forever to get that little bump out, that little divot out. Second is that you can then, if you're not good about your angle, you can just dull all the work you put in is now gone. You're going to start over again, so you dulled it because you weren't being precise. But some people do before. It's a minority, but you can. It does abrade. You just need to be in control of that. And then sometimes I'll just test, like am I able to cut wood now instead of just grinding it? So this is not super sharp, and I'm finding that it flexes. I hadn't really thought about that as a cutting edge, but it's now a cleaner cut than it was before. You can see there's little parallel lines though that run this way, and that's because I still have some tiny little bevels in the blade. The blade is not consistent across, and it leaves that kind of telltale mark, kind of the same way that bullets have the barreling imprinted in them as the rifling as they leave. So same idea. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move a little faster. So the stropping part is again, I can do it on scrap wood, which I just had, but that's fine. When I was young, I was just a piece of wood with a piece of leather on it. Any leather will work. And then I use goo, rouge, which is essentially like wax-like stuff with, I think it's rust, iron oxide in there. Aluminum oxide is probably the most popular. It just cuts really fast. I like this. I don't recall what's in the black stuff, to be honest. And all these you can buy at Harbor Freight. They're kind of less, the quality is kind of crappier in terms of the waxy material, but you can have all this stuff pretty quick. I believe I got this one from Lee Valley in the 90s, and I still have some of it left. So choose your poison. So. Some people, I should say, so the back stone has an even finer grit, so I can use this instead of the stroke to some degree, depending on what kind of stones you have. The Japanese make stones that go into this territory, same abrasiveness of this. So if this is 400 grit sandpaper, this is like 1,200 grit sandpaper, and the stones the Japanese make will go into that same gradation of fine grit. So you can literally polish the metal by using the Japanese water stones if you wish, and it starts to become that mirror chrome-like surface you associate with that kind of work.
So when you have the irregularities in the edge,
Yes.
you take that out, you're putting the flatten down.
So when I use this stone, it feels rougher, right? It is rougher because it literally is rougher. It has more gradation. So I think it was like a sawtooth. So I cut out huge chunks of the edge. And then when I use the next part, the next stone down, I'm flattening that out, and that has tinier edge marks. So on that score, pass this around again. Yeah. So you can look at the edge. This one's been used. It's not super sharp. It's still sharp enough to cut, I think. I should not claim anything before I go. So, yeah, it's still sharp. This is a 10x loop. It will scratch if you decide to poke it in there. If it scratches, I'm not going to sell it. So you still have to see what that surface looks like. It does undulate. And if that one doesn't work, you're content. We have a second loop as well. Okay.
I'm not having too much success with this.
by that pairing. I don't know how sharp that is either, so that was that. And so now, how do you know if it's sharp enough? I like to use end grain on a soft piece of wood because that is essentially the most pain in the ass maneuver I can make. It has a sheen, looks like it's wet instead of it being ripping. Right? Some people like to cut paper. I can cut paper with it. Some people will shave the back of their hand. You don't have to be that sharp to do it. I'll also note being sharp is a function of what you need to have happen. You don't need to be razor sharp for some activities. So it's that. All right, so now I'm going to show you what it looks like when you burn this kind of thing. All right, so back to here.
Okay, well, then send it along then.
Take care.
I don't know if you saw that little wisp of smoke. You can smell it a little bit, but that's what burnt metal looks like if you grind too hard too fast.
How do you tune up gouges?
All right, so we'll get that in just a
Okay.
second. So most people are coming to this kind of demonstration or this set of questions with a much smaller set of tools. Everything I mentioned right here still applies exactly the same to these. The caveat is it's a little harder to feel that kind of setup. Like here, you put that down here, you can, if you kind of rock it back and you feel where it's flat. Try out this one, and you might be there for a little bit. Really hard. Yeah. So again, if when this burns, a couple things. One is that color changes because you've retempered that metal in that location. It's not technically a burn, really. It's just that you've taken the temper out, and if you want to go through the whole tempering process, you can. It'll be minus a little bit of carbon, but it'll survive. Traditionally, people just grind by it, past it. People who use lathes are like, I just sharpen it a bit more, it's flat, we're good. Your mileage may vary depending on what your use is. Regarding smaller tools, there's a number of cheap jigs where you can throw this in there. I've noticed for the dockyards, for their gouges, they're on the point of the octagon of their handle, and then for everything else, it's on the flats. So you can literally throw this inside one of these little jigs here, assuming you have the coordination to actually speak and do this at the same time. Apparently I do not. So, short answer is you can feel that with a bit of training. You will eventually will be able to feel it. Second is you can take a Sharpie and just mark that whole surface, or steel blue, or whatever you want to do. Just mark that, and then when you make contact, you know, like right now, it needs to be higher up. The front is not making contact. But if I do it now, you will see that, we've taken away some of the Sharpie. I didn't bring a Sharpie, my bad. But that gives you feedback immediately. Am I making full contact there? You can also just literally look. This is what I actually do. And I'll take a couple of swipes and to see if the grain of the cut, you don't need a Sharpie. You can see where the stone's making contact, is if this makes sense. And after a while, you'll be able to feel it. So that's the small stuff. I will also say that for gouges in the small scale, let's talk about gouges. So what is a gouge? All right, so this is a gouge. Gouge is a curved cutting surface. All right, you use it for making flutes and curves essentially. Some people have a completely flat bevel here. Some people like two bevel. Some people like a curve. Depends on the carver and the carving they're doing. This presents two challenges beyond a flat piece of metal. One is that you'll notice my stone doesn't match that curve. Right, so one thing you can do is, where did I put them? Here. Is you can buy stones that have curves. Haha! Okay, so you can do that. And so that would fit in there someplace, and you just go back and forth. Boom. All right, just like the same before. Another way is I can make contact, find that angle just like you did there, sir, and then rotate that back and forth. I can use this finger as a stop, use this kind of the clamping mechanism to maintain that angle. And so if I do this, and I can hold that same angle across the stone. Now if I don't do anything other than here, I'm just flattening the bottom of that curve. But I can start here and I can rotate as I'm coming through, and I can get that whole surface if I wish. Other people will have been taught kind of more elaborate sweeping gesture, like a C shape or an S shape or a kind of an infinity shape to do that. So that's the outside. Okay? And you can even do that on these tools, freehand if you want. Again, rotating this way or this way. The part that's not addressed is the inside surface. You want that also, because if you have the burr pulled up, now you have the piece of metal here, and that's where things like these curves come in nicely, or this business, or this comes in water or oil stones, so you can get. You can see mine broke about 5 years ago, right before COVID, but this has that same angle, and I can pull this across that, either by this way, or locking this hand and pulling this way. So you can get these in different grits, and that's how you got on the inside. And again, when I want to hone that, also when you're done with all this stuff, you should always wipe it down, maybe a double D40 or your favorite oil so it doesn't rust. You can also take a bit of leather and stroke and use that as well. Or if you don't have that, don't want to invest in that, the piece of strap I sent around before, I can literally just this needs a little carving, it's not that sharp. Does this need sharpening, rather? Alright, so this curve roughly fits that. And I should make it a little bit deeper, but in the interest of time I'm gonna punt. Take my favorite aluminum oxide, which cuts pretty quick. And then pull. I think I should make that a little wider. But, and you can see it's starting to come with that kind of polished bit. So that's one way. And then how do you get that inside? Well, I can do the opposite. Again, same maneuver.
That's what I needed.
That's the first time I saw something.
And that applies to these as well. And again, same deal. Don't let it pop off here, because then that can round the inside. But and you see how it darkens as I make more contact with the blade, and that will get me that little bit of polish you see right in the edge there. So that, does that work? Yeah. So now I can cut across there quite easily without ripping. So that's kind of the other path, and I find that very convenient because all you need is that and this. Yeah.
Can that will work with these really small ones?
Yes.
as well?
Yes. Yep. So this is an imported set I got for $20 on Amazon, and these four were done exactly that way. It's just to make sure it worked, and you can make really nice little cuts if you wish, even an grade if you want. So, again, I would recommend a vice, but anyway. All right, so that's kind of 95% of what I was going to cover. You can also buy tools, setups that have their own little kind of valleys and stuff. Again, I think you can use scrap, but if you don't feel comfortable and have time, then this also works. But to me, the big takeaway is that once you get that tactile sense of what it feels like and what it looks like, then you don't need all this other brouhaha from my point of view. But again, personal opinion, if you don't have time to invest in that, then the various benefits I've described can be yours by just using the same angle again, or using the setup they already have. I will warn you that some of these tools have deficits if you're going to go down that path. If you use a top clamp, then your tool can wiggle this way. If you have a side one, it can still shimmy. I think it's better to spend the time and learn how to feel that angle I was talking about before. Figure out the mechanics, how you like to move, whatever shapes you like. And then those cheats, I talk about kind of clamping in and using that as your own gauge to make sure you're keeping those angles. It gives you kind of a scaffolding to move from no skills to intermediate to not spending a lot of time on it.
Do you use any jigs yourself personally?
No. Like I said, I bought this set in the 90s because I thought it'd make my life better. It didn't. I bought these sets, and these work on the small stuff, as well as this one if you're doing dockyard or whatever, for this presentation from New Jersey. So I thought maybe I was missing something. But for me personally, I don't. But I do realize that it's an investment and not everyone will get there immediately. So, you know, for $20, you can have that, and you can replicate that same angle with, marking a line somewhere so you get the same angle if you wish. But again, I like the Waterstones. I can say I paid 88 cents for this one. Your mileage may vary, but it shouldn't cost you much to get essentially a couple stones, maybe 3 if you want to go nuts. Water's cheap and plentiful in our world at this point. And then for the honing, I am a fan of one stick of the aluminum oxide. But that's kind of really it. I did find it fun to use the loop to look at tools and figure out, I thought this one isn't working because of this. So there's great feedback in seeing, my tool isn't sharp.
Yeah.
I think it's it's a diagnostic tool. If you don't have enough experience yet, you can use this and just look and go, that part's fold over, or I didn't actually sharpen that part. I missed it. That's stupid stuff. That helps. So one of those is from a leather cutting tool, and the other one's for gravers.
Thank you very much.
All right, any other questions? I've exhausted them. All right.